Good morning. Today's scripture comes from the book of Luke. It's Luke chapter 4, starting at verse 31. Hear now the word of the Lord. Then he went down to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath began to teach the people. They were amazed at his teaching because his message had authority. In a synagogue, there was a man possessed by a demon, an evil spirit. He cried out at the top of his voice, "Ha! What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly. "Come out of him." Then the demon threw the man down before them all and came out without injuring him. All the people were amazed and said to each other, "What is this teaching? With authority and power he gives orders to evil spirits, and they come out." And the news about him spread throughout the surrounding area. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, so they asked Jesus to help her. He bent over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. She got up at once and began to wait on them. When the sun was setting, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of sickness, and laying his hands on each one of them, he healed them. Moreover, demons came out of many people shouting, "You are the Son of God!" But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak, because they all know he was the Christ. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Brooke. May God add his blessing to the reading and to the teaching of his word. Amen. So it is my delight and joy to present to you my friend, my mentor, Bob Rognlien. Bob and I have known each other for 7 or 8 years now. I've been on 2 pilgrimages with him to Israel and the Holy Land, the first with a group of pastors several years ago. The second, the very eventful trip that we took year before last. The first day we were there, the war started, and it was quite an eventful trip and quite a time of learning to lean on God in powerful, new, interesting ways. Bob is a pastor, a scholar, a theologian, an archaeologist with 30 years of ministry experience. He studied at the École Biblique in Jerusalem with his archaeological work, went to Princeton Theological Seminary for his theological training. And there at the École Biblique, he studied under the eminent archaeologist Jerome Murphy O'Connor, one of the top biblical archaeologists of our time. And as I said, he's been leading trips to Israel and the Holy Land for almost 30 years, maybe a little more than 30 years, and has just brought a wealth of scholarly and practical knowledge to bear. In addition to that, he also works with 3DM Global Movements, and he does leadership training with churches all around the world. And it's just super exciting that we're able to have him here with us this weekend. This weekend we had the Jesus-Shaped Way training seminar where he took us on a deep dive into kind of the distillation of what he's been learning and over the past 30 years. It was a rich and wonderful weekend. And so it is my pleasure to invite my friend and mentor, Bob Rognlien, to preach to us today. Bring us the word, brother.
Thank you, Pastor. Well, it is a joy and a privilege to be with you this morning. We had a wonderful weekend together, those who are part of the seminar, and it's been a blessing to be staying with Pastor Russell and Tammy, who have become very dear to me and Pam. And so it's wonderful to be with you all this morning. Just to continue a little bit of introductions, this is my extended family. My wife Pam, our 2 sons, Bobby and Luke, and their 2 wives, Amy and Taylor, and our 6 grandkids, who are really the joy of our lives. We recently moved to Colorado after 30 plus years in California, and our 2 sons and their families moved with us, and we built 3 houses, kind of backing up to each other. So this is the view from our upper deck looking at our 2 sons' homes there. And we built it in such a way that we have a common yard shared kind of between the 3 houses. And this has been kind of a journey for us as we're really exploring what does it look like to live more closely as an extended family, where we can support one another, help one another, and also to be a light into our neighborhood and to just help each other carry out the mission that we feel God has given us. So it actually looks more like this right now with a little blanket of snow, but it's been a wonderful adventure, and we're excited about what God is doing there. So Pastor Russell asked me this morning if we could just look a little bit at how Jesus gathered his disciples. What does it look to kind of live more in the community the way that Jesus did and his followers? As we think about the culture that we live in one of the most individualistic cultures ever in the history of the world. And we have this kind of, our heritage goes back to this rugged individualism of this idea that, the pioneer mentality, that we can kind of go out there on our own, the lone ranger out there surviving. And I come from Montana, so that culture is very strong there. And there's wonderful things about individualism because it really points to the responsibility of each person to be a steward of what God has entrusted to them. But there's also real downfalls to individualism. The truth is, life is hard, and to try to face the challenges of life alone is actually not very wise. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there are some cultures that are highly collectivism. And these are cultures where the emphasis is on the community. The emphasis is on the group as a whole. And there are wonderful things about that approach, the support that's there. But there can also be the downfall of not taking responsibility as individuals. And so this morning we're going to think a little bit about what is the way of Jesus when it comes to community. Are we to live kind of under an individualistic approach, or is it more of a collectivist approach? What is the way of Jesus? Now, you might remember Jesus' great I am statement. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I know in my Christian walk, I've really emphasized the truth of Jesus a lot. For many years, that was kind of my focus, was to understand, what does the Bible teach about Jesus? What did Jesus himself teach? And that's wonderful because Jesus has the best truth ever, right? The truth that sets us free. But I would also look at the life of Jesus and feel kind of intimidated, really kind of disconnected, thinking I could never live a life that looks like Jesus. I mean, what an extraordinary life he lived. But in all that, I never paid a lot of attention to the way of Jesus until I started traveling in the Holy Land, until I started to really look at the culture of Jesus' ministry. And I started to realize that there's a pattern to Jesus' life. There were rhythms that Jesus chose. There were specific ways that Jesus lived and carried out his mission. And to be a disciple, to follow Jesus, is not just to believe in the truth, but it's also to follow the way. And Pam and I have found in our lives that the more we have kind of studied and learned the way of Jesus and imitated his way of life, as we have learned and trusted the truth of Jesus, that the result of that has been the life of Jesus growing in us, that our lives have been shaped more and more by the life of Jesus. And so, as I said, as Pastor Russell mentioned, we've spent a lot of time traveling in the Holy Land over the last 30 years, taking people there. And what we found is that the truth of Jesus kind of jumps off the pages of the Bible, but the way of Jesus is a little more subtle. And when you actually go to the places where Jesus lived and carried out his mission, the way of Jesus starts to come into focus. So this morning I'm going to take you to a couple of places in the Holy Land, and we're going to just look at what we can learn about how Jesus built community. What does a Jesus-shaped community look like? So after Jesus was baptized, he returned to his hometown of Nazareth. Now this is modern Nazareth. It's a fairly large Palestinian Arab city in Israel. And when Jesus returned there, he was coming back to his family. And Jesus was asked, even though he wasn't trained as a rabbi, he was asked to speak in the synagogue when he went there. And the message that he gave was the message of this messianic kingdom, but that it was for Gentiles as well as for Jews. And that enraged the Jews there who had become so embittered. In fact, they took him to the brow of a hill, a cliff, where they were going to throw him down. Now, the sermon's got to be pretty bad if they're trying to kill you, right? But they were reacting against this vision that Jesus had of a kingdom that was for all people. And this is Mount Precipice, which is just outside of Nazareth. Nazareth is built on a ridge that overlooks the Jezreel Valley. And we don't know exactly where they were going to throw him down, but this is the traditional location. But somehow Jesus passed through the crowd and he went down to Capernaum. Jesus said, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household." And something that's easy to forget is that Jesus' family was there. When they were getting ready to kill him, Jesus' family was there, and they didn't speak out. They didn't try to protect him. And I think that must have been one of the most painful moments in Jesus' life, when he realized that not only his hometown, but even his own family did not embrace his vision of the kingdom. And so Jesus left Nazareth, there kind of in central Galilee. He made the half-day journey down to Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee is this beautiful freshwater lake up there in the north of Galilee. And when we go on our trips, we love swimming in the lake every day. It's so refreshing and beautiful. And Capernaum is this medium-sized town that sat on the northern shore of this beautiful lake. And because it was uninhabited since ancient times, archaeologists have been able to excavate extensively this little town. And they found some pretty amazing things. The most visible one is this synagogue. This is built a couple of hundred years after the time of Jesus, but it was built directly on the foundations of the first century synagogue. So the reading that we heard this morning about Jesus coming to the synagogue, this is the synagogue that he came to. And this is where he taught with authority. This is where he cast out the unclean spirits. It's pretty amazing that we can visit that place today. But what happened after that synagogue gathering was quite significant, because it says that he arose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. So Simon is inviting Jesus into his home and into his family. But that word house can be a little bit misleading, because in our kind of Western modern culture, we think of a house as a single family dwelling, and we think of a family as a nuclear family, mom and dad and kids at best, right? And because that's how we tend to live. But that's not the way people lived in biblical times. In fact, this word house, the Greek word is oikos, and it means an extended family that lived together in a kind of compound, and they shared life and vocation together. There was family business that kind of the family was built around. And this was quite a different way of living with multiple nuclear families. And it could be comprised of multiple generations, grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, kids, cousins, even non-blood relations, servants, employees of the family business. And they all lived together in one sort of extended family house. They shared life together, they shared their meals together, and they carried out the family business together. And so when we go to Capernaum, in addition to the synagogue, we also see the houses, the oikos houses that they excavated there. And you can kind of see on the left side of the picture here, there's a doorway leading from the street into what was an open-air courtyard. And this is how all the houses were designed. You come into the courtyard, there's a clay oven in the corner, there's some grinders for cooking, there was a little porch roof, and this courtyard connects about 5 different rooms where nuclear families lived, and they shared life together. The courtyard was kind of their common space. And as they excavated this town, they found this is how all the houses were in Capernaum, these extended family homes. But there was one home that was a little different, because right in the middle of the first century, right after the time of Jesus, it underwent a change. They started to plaster the floor and the walls of the main room of this oikos house. The pottery tells us that it changed in function from just a private residence to a public gathering place. And they found in the plaster graffiti referring to Jesus and Peter. And so the archaeologists discovered this is actually the remains of the house of Simon and his brother Andrew. They lived there with their families, also with Simon's in-laws lived there together, and this is where they carried out their fishing business. And here you can see underneath that modern church that's kind of built over it to protect it and give access to it, you can see the threshold of a doorway on kind of the left side leading into the kind of rough pavement of their courtyard. And then they had actually 7 rooms that surrounded that courtyard. It's actually the largest home that they found in Capernaum. And this is the home of Simon and Andrew, the very place where Jesus was invited after that synagogue service. And to invite someone into your oikos was a big deal. It's a honor, shame culture. So you would only invite someone into your oikos if they were someone of good standing in the community, somebody who would bring honor to your family. You would never invite someone of a lower social standing, someone of moral questionability, or even people with diseases or certain injuries who were considered cursed by God. You wouldn't invite them because they would bring shame to your family. So when they invite Jesus into the oikos, it's kind of a big deal. It says he arose, he left the synagogue, and he entered Simon's house, Simon's oikos. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever. And I used to think, oh, maybe they're visiting for Thanksgiving or something. No, she's there. She lives there. She's part of this extended family. And they appealed to Jesus on her behalf. So he stood over her, he rebuked the fever, and it left her. And immediately she rose and began to serve them. Now, this is a wonderful moment for Simon and Andrew's oikos, right? Jesus is there. He's healed mom. They're rejoicing. They're sharing a meal together. He's probably telling parables and teaching them. I mean, it's a wonderful moment. But then Jesus does something so countercultural that none of them could have expected it. It says, when the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on every one of them and healed them. And demons also came out of many, crying, "You are the Son of God." But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak because they knew that he was the Christ. Do you see what Jesus did here? Jesus opened up the door of the oikos and he invited everyone in. You know, when demon-possessed people are invited, that pretty much means everyone's invited, right? They're kind of the bottom of the social ladder. And this was not done. You didn't do this in that culture. But what Jesus was doing, he was showing them a whole new way to be a family. You see, the oikos was inward focused. The oikos existed for the oikos, to provide, to protect. Everything was kind of for the oikos. But it was almost as if Jesus took the oikos and turned it inside out. He was showing them how to be a family, not just for themselves, but also for others. And when we think about this amazing event in Jesus' life, it was not a one-time occurrence. This actually was part of the pattern of Jesus' life. This was the way that Jesus lived. In fact, as we pick up the story in the Gospel of Mark, right after that event, Jesus took some of his disciples out on a little mission trip to some other towns and villages. And then Mark says, when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. Oh, already the home of Simon and Andrew has become Jesus' oikos. That's the Greek word there. Jesus was in his oikos. And many were gathered there, so there was no more room, not even at the door. So you see, that's the same pattern, isn't it? Jesus is welcoming people into the oikos. So much so that it filled up that courtyard, and he was preaching the word to them. So we can kind of picture this setting, right? Jesus is maybe in that main room. The courtyard is full of people. And then Mark tells us that 4 friends brought a paralyzed friend with them, and when they could not get near him because of the crowd, so they presumably came in that door to the courtyard, but the courtyard was so full of people, they couldn't get their friend to Jesus in the main room. And so it says, they removed the roof above him, and when they had made an opening, they let down the bed on which the paralytic lay. Now, these guys were determined, weren't they? But it kind of raises some questions, like how do you get a paralytic up onto the roof and dig a hole in the roof? And how does that work? Well, it's interesting, when you look at these houses, here you can see an obvious doorway to one of these houses, and notice just on the left of that door, there's a set of steps. Can you see that? Yeah, and every single house in Capernaum had a set of steps going up to the rooftop. And in fact, we can see in the house of Simon and Andrew, there's the threshold of the door on the left edge of that picture. And now on the right half edge of this picture, you can see steps going up. And so that's actually the steps that they used when they carried this man up onto the roof. And so what we're seeing is Jesus' mission was centered in this oikos, in this house. They lowered the man down through the roof, right, to where Jesus was in that room. He forgave him. He healed him. And what we see is that the oikos has become the center of Jesus' mission. He loved teaching in the synagogue, and his whole life he was a regular participant in the services of the synagogue, but he centered his mission in a home and in a family, a new kind of family. Now, what's interesting is when you visit Capernaum, there's this modern church built over that house. And when you go into the church, you see that in the center, there's a large opening in the floor. And in fact, that opening exactly matches the main room of the house of Simon and Andrew below. And when you look down you're looking down into that room of the house, you realize, oh, that's the perspective of the 4 friends as they lowered their paralyzed friend to Jesus. So it's kind of beautiful the way it just puts you right in the oikos, right in the story there. So Mark goes on in chapter 3, he tells about Jesus going out and carrying the good news to other towns and villages. But then it says in verse 20, he went home. He's back to the oikos. And the crowd gathered again. So you see the pattern. Jesus opens up his family. He opens up his home. He welcomes people in. And when his family heard it, meaning his biological family back in Nazareth, Remember, the ones that did not stand with him, they didn't embrace his vision. Well, when they heard about this, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he is out of his mind. Right? If you have someone in your family with mental illness and they're out on the streets, what do? You go and find them and bring them home and nurse them back to health, right? And that's kind of what Mary and his brothers are trying to do. They come down to Capernaum. They're standing outside, meaning outside that door of the house of Simon and Andrew, and they called to him. A crowd was inside sitting around him. You see the pattern. Once again, Jesus has gathered this spiritual family together. And they said to him, your mother and brothers are outside seeking you. They're kind of passing the message through the crowd to Jesus. And when Jesus hears it, he answers, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. Pretty amazing, huh? Jesus is giving us a definition of his family. To be a part of Jesus' family, to live in the way of Jesus, is to be those who are doing the will of God. That's what defines his family, not blood, but spirit, mission. That's the definition of this family. Jesus built a whole new kind of family. Now, remember, Jesus was a single man. He had no wife. He had no children. Even his own biological family had rejected him. And yet, he was able to build the most amazing family ever in the history of the world. Because you see, the followers of Jesus realized this is the way of Jesus. And so they continued to follow this pattern as they followed Jesus. In fact, after the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem, Luke tells us, the followers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. That was kind of that constituted their life together. But here's where they did it. Look at how Luke explains. Every day, they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple. There was this huge, beautiful, amazing public gathering place, the temple, kind of like this beautiful building that we're in right here, which is a wonderful place to gather large groups of people. But they also met together and broke bread from house to house. You can guess the word, right? From oikos to oikos, from extended family to extended family. They were following the pattern of Jesus. Jesus gathered in the synagogue. Eventually, he gathered crowds on the hillsides, but he also gathered them into this spiritual family, this house full of disciples. And this was the pattern of those who followed Jesus. Paul explains it to the Ephesians this way. He said, you're no longer strangers and aliens. You're fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. Guess what the word is? There it is, oikos. You're members of this extended family of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. You see, Paul's saying, this is the way of Jesus. This is our identity. We're meant to be part of a spiritual family that carries out the will of God. Pastor Russell mentioned that we lead a trip through Turkey and Greece following the missional journeys of Paul. And as we go along in that trip, everywhere we go and every city we visit, we find that this is what Paul was doing. He was planting spiritual families on mission. That's what Luke calls the churches, right? They didn't have big public buildings to gather in like this. They gathered in homes as spiritual families, living out the mission of Jesus. Lydia, Titius Justus, Phoebe, Aquila, Priscilla, Nympha, Philemon, all built these spiritual families in their homes, in their oikos. A family on mission. That's what we like to think of it as. It's not just a biological family, it's a spiritual family. It's not just a nuclear family, it's an extended family. And it's not a family that just serves itself, but it's a family that is seeking and saving the lost, a family that's doing the will of God, carrying out the mission of God. So that's what a family on mission is. It's a house full of people sharing life together, welcoming people of peace, and growing as disciples and making disciples. This is the way of Jesus. This is what Jesus invites us into. As I mentioned, we moved to Colorado with some of our biological extended family, and the reason we did that is that we wanted to learn how to live a little bit more in this way, that we wanted to live more as an extended family, and also to help each other, but also to help us reach out into our neighborhood and to be a light to them. And so each of us in our extended family have been getting to know our neighbors, and we've started inviting them into about every month or so. We have a gathering, and we ask people to just bring food. It's like a potluck gathering. We share a meal together, and we just have a wonderful time getting to know each other, building our friendships with our neighbors. And this is something that would be very hard to do, like just me and Pam, but because we have kind of an extended family, it's much more effective. We have more resources and more support to do that. And it's been really exciting to see how we're beginning to be able to show the good news and share the good news in our neighborhood because we're living as an extended spiritual family. A lot of times we kind of theme our gatherings around whatever holiday is going on. So our most recent one was kind of a Christmas gathering, and we decorated Christmas cookies, which was a huge mess, but a whole lot of fun. And again, another opportunity just to get to know our neighbors and build community. So what is the way of Jesus? Individualism or collectivism? Well, it's neither of those things. It's both of those things. Jesus calls us as individuals to be responsible for our own standing before God, our own response of faith. But he also calls us into a family. I mean, this life is too hard to live alone. It's not wise to try to be that lone ranger. We're called into something better. We're called to live in a Jesus-shaped family, a family that is living out the mission of God together. And I'll tell you what, in our case, we're weird. It's unusual that you can do that as a biological extended family. So we're kind of the exception to the rule. But as I said, Jesus did it, a single man with no children, rejected by his family. And so this is available to anyone. We can all learn how to gather together in this way. And that's the invitation of Jesus. When Jesus says, follow me, he says, believe in me, which is the truth of Jesus, but he also says, follow me, which is pattern your life after my life. And so I just want to ask you to ponder, what is your response? Are you a part of a family on mission? Now I know Pastor Russell started a couple of abide groups last year to begin to explore what does it look like to build a sense of spiritual family. I mean, there's a sense in which when we gather like this, we're a big spiritual family, like Jesus gathered in the synagogue or the Jerusalem church gathered at the temple. But there's something different when we gather in homes and we share meals together and we start to connect at a deeper level. That's where we start to truly become a part of a family, a Jesus-shaped family that is living on mission together. And I know Pastor Russell's about to kick off some more abide groups, and I'll be telling you more about that in the future. And I want to really urge you to consider that would be a way to just explore what is it like to live as part of a family the way that Jesus did. Let's just close with a little time of reflection, of listening to the Lord and asking Jesus these two questions. What are you saying to me? And what, Jesus, is that next step of faith that you want me to take? So let's just prayerfully come before the Lord and just listen to him as we ask those questions. We thank you, Jesus, that you are the way and the truth and the life for us. And we thank you that you're inviting us as disciples to follow you and to live as we believe, so that we can live this Jesus-shaped life. And so, Lord, as you invite us into spiritual family, just give us faith, give us courage to respond, and to keep taking one step of faith at a time, so that we truly can live in your way, Jesus. We ask it in your name. Amen.